Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, thanking you as our listeners for joining us on today's episode. It's actually the Memorial Day weekend here in the United States, so wishing you a happy and safe Memorial Day weekend as we remember those who have given their lives in the sacrifice of freedom. Today's episode is going to be also a little bit different. It's amazing the number of times that we start the podcast episode that way. I've been talking about this, though, for a little over a month now about a coming thing that we're going to be doing, which is primarily going to be focused and featured on our Patreon feed, although parts of it will appear here on the regular podcast feed. And that's that we're going to be looking at an extended overview of a big historical what if. And that big historical what if actually revolves around what is known as the late Bronze Age collapse. And so today's episode is sort of an introduction to what that will be about, and also a primer about what is the late Bronze Age collapse. I just want to give some background here so that those that might be interested in what we will do as we explore the various what-ifs of that historical scenario at least have a background or an understanding about why this is such a significant event in history and why it's worthy of more than just an episode or two, just because of the far-reaching geographic, but also the far-reaching temporal aspects of its impact on history. And so today, when we come back from the break, we will start by providing an introduction to, first of all, what was the Bronze Age, and then a little bit of an introduction as to what is the late Bronze Age collapse and why that's important to look at, and sort of set up what will be a series of episodes, again, both here on the main podcast feed as well as on our Patreon feed. So we hope you stay with us after the break for this historical background and an exploration of why it's important to discuss the what if of what if there had been no late Bronze Age collapse.
Alexis here, taking a little break from the podcast with
me, it's Don.
And we want to tell you a little bit about the site we actually use to host our podcast, and that would be Buzzsprout. So what are some of the features that you really, really like about Buzzsprout, Dad?
One of the things that I do most of the editing and posting, so I probably interact with it far more tthan Alexis did. One of the things I like about it is it's easy to use. It's point and click. The interface is really straightforward and clean. So it's easy to know once you've got a file what you do, how you get it uploaded, all the various things that you would do, scheduling, just the mechanics I find pretty simple to use. So I think that's something pretty technically savvy, but I don't think you have to be technically savvy in order to be able to do. Buzzsprout has a lot of wonderful tutorials I've used on that about equipment and how to do things and other things like that. So that's one of the things I like. They make it easy. I think they're relatively inexpensive. You can easily get your podcast started for a low initial investment, and then as it grows, be able to do some additional things with it. And I like it. We've talked about this a number of times because of the stats and the feedback and the other things that they do that allow us to understand not only how many listeners and how many downloads, but where those listeners are. We can get a better understanding about this time that we're spending recording this stuff. Is anybody actually listening to that?
And Buzzsprout says yes.
Buzzsprout makes that easy. So what's the deal that we've managed to get for our listeners if they want to explore the world of creating their own podcast on Buzzsprout?
Yeah, if you follow the link in our show notes, you can get set up on Buzzsprout. And because you follow that link, we get a little bit of support from that. But then we're also supporting you as well, because we don't think of you as competition at all in this we say welcome to the podcast family. So if you are interested in starting your own podcast, but we think Buzzsprout is a great place to start, so follow that link in the show notes, and they will walk you through setting up the process. Like Dad said, it was a super easy setup, tons of tutorials and tons of step-by-step instructions as we got started, because we didn't know really a lot when we got the podcast started, so Buzzsprout was a big help for us.
Good deal. We hope you check it out. Thanks. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today leading us through our introductory episode here to what will branch off into a number of different episodes, as we talked about before the break. And that's our focus here at A Fork in Time on the late Bronze Age collapse. And so today's episode is intended to be a fairly brief introduction. There'll be a more extensive introduction actually on the portion of this series that is found on the Patreon feed. And then, of course, we'll circle back with some of those episodes actually being available on the primary feed. But as we get started today, I wanted to provide just a high-level overview of why this is something that we've chosen to focus on here at A Fork in Time, why it's something that's worthy of a number of different episodes, and why we're going to focus on it. It is a big in my brain there, as I was saying, that has all capital letters, B-I-G, and it's bold and it's underscored. It is a big historical, almost epoch event in the history, particularly of what I would call recent antiquity. That's the way that I will describe it. Whether that's how a historian would describe it or not, I don't know. But it's a very significant event because of where the impact occurs in terms of geographically, how it influences what eventually will be the world that leads to the Roman Empire and ultimately leads to what we think of as being the West, but also influences back on Eastern civilizations as well. It's a big event, which is why it's worthy of focus and why it's worthy of more than just an episode or two. So in terms of setting up why we're going to focus on that, two things I wanted to cover today. First of all is what is the Bronze Age? Obviously, if you're going to have a late Bronze Age collapse, you understand why late in that age collapse makes a difference. And so understanding just the importance and some generalities around the Bronze Age is a good place to start. Then we'll talk a little bit about the actual event or events. It's actually going to be something that we spend a lot of time working through, is what was the cause of the late Bronze Age collapse, because that's something of a mystery and something of an interesting thing just in and of itself to explore. But talking about sort of what the event was and how it sets up and how we'll branch off into a number of different what-if explorations by looking at that as a what-if event here on the podcast. First of all, talking about the Bronze Age itself. Why is the Bronze Age important? Well, the Bronze Age is important first by understanding a little bit about what goes on with the working of metal, so metallurgical types of things, and why eventually bronze will be replaced by iron, but that is later in history, and that obviously has a separate set of significance. But the Bronze Age is a fairly long period of time that causes the rise and the expression of a number of different important historical civilizations. Generally, historians would define it as a prehistoric period. Prehistoric, of course, prehistoric means before writing. And while that is a true description of what most of the Bronze Age is, it's actually during the period of the Bronze Age that the first elements that we recognize today and that archaeologists have discovered that we know as being writing actually appear. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the rise of civilization age. Certainly this is a big thing in the Fertile Crescent, what's going on in the area which eventually will become Sumeria and Babylon. And you'll see historians also refer to the Bronze Age as being the period of time where there's some proto-writing, meaning the early development of writing systems and systems of recording information, including history, in a way that we've been able to understand. So first of all, understanding the Bronze Age is generally considered for the most part to be prehistoric, or at least has its origins in prehistory, there before we have writing and we have the types of things that allow us to fully understand all of the events and the people groups and what's happening there. But what's important about the Bronze Age is it causes to rise the prevalence of a substance, bronze. Bronze is not a single natural element. For example, iron is a single natural metal that is found naturally in its pure form. It can be obviously worked and fashioned and mixed with other things. We certainly have done that as we move forward to the era of steel, for example. But you don't find bronze naturally in nature. In fact, bronze is comprised and composed of actually combining metals together. And the primary component that is part of bronze is copper. And copper has a much lower melting point than iron does. While iron is found fairly prevalently and naturally in large amounts in nature, meteorites and other things like that. It is not easily worked. In fact, the melting point, or the point at which you can actually fashion iron, is approximately 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, or almost 1,600 degrees Celsius. And so it requires being able to produce a tremendous amount of heat and the type of fire that for most of human history has not been able to be produced. And so the ability to fashion and work iron was limited by the fact that you could not produce fires hot enough to be able to do things with it. However, bronze is a slightly different thing, and it can be produced by smelting copper being its primary component, along with other metals, the primary other metal being that of tin. And so generally speaking, we'll talk about this a lot as we go through the study, because it's an important part of understanding what was going on in the late Bronze Age and then the impacts of the collapse itself, is that generally speaking, bronze is approximately 90% copper, and in most instances, for most of the Bronze Age, 10% tin. TEN percent, tin, TIN, comprising the other part of what is used for bronze. Arsenic and other types of metals could be mixed in to also produce bronze with copper, but primarily tin was the second metal that went with copper in order to be able to produce what we know as being bronze. Bronze is a much more durable metal than stone is, and so the production of bronze as something that could be used not only for decoration, but more importantly, could be used for weapons and could be used for other technology types of things becomes very important. So copper has a relatively moderate melting point, approximately a little under 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And tin, which is the other component here, actually has a melting point that's under 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's possible to produce in fairly primitive fires and kilns enough heat consistently to be able to bring copper to its melting point and to bring tin to its melting point, and thus to combine those two metals together to produce bronze. Not exactly sure who really first became aware of that. It could have been perhaps as far back as 6,000 BC, when there was a beginning of an understanding about how to mix these two metals together and produce fires that were hot enough to do that. But certainly by the time of 3,000 BC, we see the rise of a number of artifacts that are in bronze. So that's weapons, statues, household items, the types of things that are in everyday use. Bronze became the metal of choice, but particularly could be used well to create weapons that were more durable and were able to have finer edges. And so it changed the nature of warfare as well, moving away to being able to incorporate bronze weapons. And so the Bronze Age is important because it enabled a number of things that did not exist in the latter Stone Ages that exist before. And so for the period of time, approximately from, roughly what we would call, 3 to 4,000 BC down until approximately 1100 to 1000 BC is when we have the era that's known as the Bronze Age. And during this period of time, we have the rise of a number of different civilizations, cultures, and city-states. So, for example, the rise of the various things that are part of the Fertile Crescent, the Tigris-Euphrates River scenario there. Again, what eventually will become Babylon, but is Sumeria, and the other civilizations that arise ahead of that are during the Bronze Age, back from the early Bronze Age through the Middle Bronze Age. The early Bronze Age running from the period from about 3,000 to 3,300 BC down to around, roughly speaking, 2,000 BC, give or take. The Middle Bronze Age then running from about 2,000 BC down to about 1,400, 1,500 BC, and then the Late Bronze Age from about 1,500 on. It's during this period of time that many of the civilizations that are known as the cradles of civilization arise. So I mentioned already a number of times the area that would be in modern day Iraq, where Babylon would eventually be, and where other empires would follow beyond that. But also this is the period of time when we have the rise of Egypt. We have the rise of some of the Greek cultures, particularly the Mycenaean culture. A lot of different cultures arose throughout the entire course of the Bronze Age. And these are cultures that eventually became to be very dominant cultures as we draw towards the end of the Bronze Age. And so we have, towards the end of the Bronze Age, things like Egypt, the various, in Mesopotamia, again, the Sumerian transitioning to the Assyrian and the Babylonian, and ultimately the Kassite empires. In the Near East, we have, and in Greece, we have the Mycenaean age as well. So we have the Hittites in Anatolia, the region of Anatolia, what is modern day Turkey. We have these very, very, very large, growing, powerful, long enduring empires that have arisen to being in a position of supremacy and a position of note by the end of the Bronze Age. So by the time we reach the late Bronze Age, again, I'm roughly going to use the year 1200 BC throughout most of our discussion to sort of mark the end of the Bronze Age. That'll be the period of time we're talking about here with the Bronze Age collapse, which is what this is all about, is that we're going to, as we draw down towards 1200 BC, we have a tremendous number of large, powerful kingdoms. Again, the Hittites. We have Egypt as a powerful and growing empire. We have what had been the area of Samaria again, and now the Akkadians and the Babylonians. All of that is happening as we draw down towards the end of the Bronze Age. And these empires had risen based upon that technology, on the bronze technology, the ability to fashion bronze weapons, bronze tools, taking them from what had been the age of the Stone Age, moving into the Bronze Age. This is also the period of time when we have the rise of civilization more in the forms of organized city-states, and we have the rise of agriculture in all of these areas, for example, the Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and the Euphrates in Sumeria, some of the other locations, sort of taming the cycles of flood and river over seasonal aspects to be able to actually conduct agriculture in a way such that we have the rise of cities. There's enough food, there's enough supply. The technology that's been brought on by bronze has enabled these civilizations to flourish, since they look more like the civilizations that we will see moving forward from this time, that have cities and that are organized around central authorities. Although in many cases we still have particularly in the Sumeria area, the city-state, although those are very large city-states, being a big part of what's there. The same is also true, although slightly different from an agricultural aspect, in the areas that we think of as being the Greek culture, particularly near the Aegean there and around the Aegean, but also in places like Cyprus and on what is the coast of Asia Minor. So the far western components of Asia, as it transitions there in modern-day Turkey towards the areas that we think of as being Greece, both historically as well as in modern times. And so the setup for the late Bronze Age collapse are these empires, and we will spend a good amount of time over the various episodes that we explore here talking about those empires and their fall, because it's the what-ifs of what if those empires had succeeded and had not fallen that have the big impact on history moving forward. So a lot of what we will spend time in the various episodes as we explore the late Bronze Age collapse are looking at the impacts of the ends of these empires, and of course the what-ifs then of what rose in their place. And that's why this event is so critical, because it's a watershed event that occurs over about a 200-year span of time that alters the map of much of what we think of as being the world that we focus so much of our study of history on. And it's also the event that brings things to an end but allows other things to rise. And so again, these epoch type events in history are important because of what they end, but the end of something permits space for the beginning of something else. And we'll be constantly exploring that as we go through this. So that's a little bit of the background on what is the Bronze Age. Let's focus a little bit now on what is the late Bronze Age collapse. And first of all, it's important to understand that collapse is an important and effective term, because what collapses here are these cultures. And they collapse in ways that are striking, that are phenomenal. And they collapse in ways that historians and archaeologists are still trying to get a good, solid understanding of. Some of these cultures do survive. Some of these nation states and empires do survive. A good example of that would be Egypt. But Egypt before the late Bronze Age collapse and Egypt after the late Bronze Age collapse are very different. So even for those civilizations that survive this collapse, this major catastrophic event, they are altered in ways that are significant and important. Egypt probably being the best example of that. It might be argued that some of the Greek elements of Greek culture and Greek civilization also do that, but Egypt is probably going to be our poster child for even what happens with those civilizations that survived the collapse. But what does definitely happen beginning sometime, roughly the half century again, between approximately 1200 BC and 1150 BC, is we have a widespread collapse of these cultures. And that the collapse is both political, but it also appears to be a large social collapse as well. So we see conflict, we see wars, we see civil wars, we see uprisings. We see what definitely appears to be disruptions in what had grown to be a global trade network at that point. We'll talk a little bit about that in the second introduction that we do for this, about how the need for copper and tin to be combined together for bronze had created a trade network that historians and archaeologists are really only now grasping in terms of its scope and its size. Who was trading with whom and how far artifacts and materials were being traded across the world within the last century, we've come to understand is much, much more profound than was previously thought. And so what comes to an end is not only the collapse of these individual empires and these individual city-states and these individual positions of political authority and the social situations that collapse with them, but there's also a collapse of trade. There's a collapse, appears to be certainly incidents of drought and other situations where there's starvation and there's famine, and so there's an ecological upheaval that goes along with this. And understanding the relationship between this ecological upheaval and potentially how that played upon and how that played a role in the political social upheaval is going to be something that we will explore as well. Is there a single cause to the late Bronze Age collapse? Historians disagree about this. It most likely is, like so many things in history, it's a series of things, and sometimes it's a series of things that happen in a timing or at the same time in such a way that it has tremendous impact. But the end result is from the period from about 1200 BC moving forward over the next century, is that with the exception of Egypt, which comes out of the backside of this much weakened and much different than it was before, all of these major empires and city-states that I've talked about have collapsed. And as a result, the entire map of much of the known world, when we're talking around what we think of as being southeastern Europe, around North Africa, around the Near East, Middle East, is changed. That is what happens during the late Bronze Age collapse. And because of that change, what happens after that is forever altered. And that's where we will focus our various what-if trajectories as we move forward. So hope you found the primer today, the background, a little bit helpful in terms of grasping and understanding why we want to pursue this. And again, we're going to do deeper dives into each one of these areas, which will allow us to go back and look at a little bit of the history. Some of what I've glossed over today will certainly go into much deeper detail. And by the way, these episodes will include a number of different co-hosts and guests, so it won't just be a Don monologue moving forward on each one of these things. And we'll explore the implications in the near term during this period of time. So now we're talking about the first millennia BC, but we'll also see how that plays down. And in many instances, these historical what-ifs play very far down, all the way down to modern age. That's why this event is worthy of sort of getting special consideration here in our genre of alternate history. So we hope that you joined us for that. We hope that you participate with that. This is going to be one of the ways we also hope to probably engage a little bit more with message boards and other things on our website to have more of a dialogue that goes on around this and a place for questions to be asked. And so we're excited about how that's going to be. And that's going to occupy a lot of our summer and probably into the early fall here on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times where you're going to find these various episodes. So let me talk a little bit about that. The introduction that I've just provided here is obviously on our main podcast feed. We have a lot of other things that are already planned for the feed and the production schedule here for the summer. A lot of those are already in the can or in the works. And so we're excited about what's happening with that. And so this particular series on the late Bronze Age collapse will find itself primarily for those that are patrons on our Patreon feed. So let me explain a little bit how that works. Patreon is a wonderful platform that allows those that want to support all types of artistic endeavors, not just podcasts and not just YouTube channels and that type of things, although that's a big part of what Patreon has enabled. But what Patreon is a platform that enables patrons, those that want to support those endeavors, to provide support to the artist. I don't even want to use the word artist to describe what I am, but to those individuals, including artists, who are producing things like podcasts, YouTube channels, etc. So A Fork in Time has our Patreon presence, and we're thankful that we have the patrons that we do that do provide some financial support for the show. One of the things that we want to do for those folks is not just say thank you, which we do frequently, regularly, and should, for their support to help defray the costs of the primary podcast, but also reward folks that are our patrons with something a little bit extra. And you see this, again, a lot of folks who have a presence on Patreon do this, and we certainly want to do that as well. And so we've been endeavoring to get better about producing special, unique content that is only available there. So let me explain what that's about. It's not that I don't want this content to be part of the primary feed for Fork in Time. And that's why you'll see some of the discussions here, particularly some of the higher level, broader discussions, will probably find their way here to the main feed, the main episodes that we produce each week on A Fork in Time. So you'll see parts of this on the main feed. But over on Patreon, for those that are subscribers, you have the ability to get access to a special feed where we put those special episodes. So just like you have the feed that feeds your podcatcher to hear me talking to you now, a separate feed will allow you to have access to that exclusive content. And we do a couple of things over there with exclusive content, particularly now as we're getting much more developed with our production schedule and getting where we're producing things ahead of just in real time. We release episodes early there very frequently, so it's an opportunity to hear an episode before it actually releases here on the main feed. But this is also where you will find the bulk of these episodes that relate to the Late Bronze Age collapse. Essentially, that's going to be special episodes that are only going to be found there. So if you want to hear those episodes, we want you to hear those episodes, you'll need to become part of what we do over on Patreon. So you might be asking yourself, okay, Don, what is that going to cost me? Well, it's basically going to cost you what you choose to have it cost you. There are a couple of different patron levels that exist there, so you can subscribe to one of those patron levels for a monthly amount. And anyone that subscribes to any of those patron levels has access to that exclusive content, the exclusive feed that's there. We are actually going to create some levels over there that are exclusively for this. And so it's an opportunity to actually go in and for a very nominal amount each month, just have access. If all you want to do is subscribe and be part of being able to listen to those special episodes, which we intend to have at least 2 of those in June, and then at least 2 or 3 in each of the additional months following after in July, August, and probably into September. Right now, we're looking at about an 8 to 10 episode run to really do the Late Bronze Age collapse justice with the episodes and the various what-ifs that we want to explore there, which are pretty exciting. And so if you'd like to hear those feeds, what you need to do is go over and become a patron. So you'll find in the show notes here the link to our Patreon page. Once you get there, it's pretty easy to see. You'll quickly see, basically there's a patron level that is just called Late Bronze Age Collapse. And so when you get there, you can sign up just for that patron level. And what you should know about if you sign up for that particular patron level is that at the end of the Late Bronze Age Collapse series, we will automatically end those monthly subscriptions for patrons that choose that particular level. So I want to make it very clear that if you choose that particular level of patronage on Patreon, we're going to recognize that as being unique, and we will proactively at the end of that period, we will deactivate those patron links. Now, of course, if you want to continue to support the show as a patron beyond that, you can come back and then subscribe to one of the normal patron levels that exist there on Patreon. Or if you want to go ahead and be able to receive the Late Bronze Age Collapse series and know that when it's over, you'll continue to receive the exclusive things that we do there on Patreon, you should go ahead and subscribe to one of the other patron levels. I hope I've explained that in a way that makes sense. So if the only reason you're coming over to Patreon, the only reason you're becoming a patron is to be able to hear the Late Bronze Age Collapse series, And when that's over, you want to stop anything that's a financial commitment to us. And by the way, you can stop those financial commitments at any time, I should say that. Then you would choose that, because we will automatically end those commitments at the end of the late Bronze Age collapse. If you choose any of our other patron levels, you're going to get included in what's there in the late Bronze Age collapse. And we would certainly welcome you to join those things. And we appreciate any support that you provide the podcast on an ongoing basis. It helps to defray the cost, helps to offset some of what it takes to bring the podcast to you, and it's appreciated. Again, as Alexis and I have said a number of times, this podcast endeavor was never intended to be a money-making venture, but there are costs associated with keeping it going, and the ways that our patrons have helped with that are greatly appreciated. So I invite you to look in the show note links to get over to the Patreon page, or go to our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com in order to see what's going on there. I can't sort of close out a show or do anything else right now without also mentioning the other exciting thing that we're still excited about for June, and that's the launch of our new second podcast, and that's The Room Where It Happened. A lot of things that are going on now to get that ready, so we're real excited about that, and the first episodes are due for late June. They are on a monthly release schedule. And so if you still are interested in being part of The Room Where It Happened, again, on our website, also a link in the show notes here, a way to link over to how to join our team. That's also true if you want to become part of the regular team at A Fork in Time. As you know, we encourage and are proud to have co-hosts and other participants. There's other roles as well, behind-the-scene roles. Some of them are technical and other types of things there. So if you're interested in becoming more integrated and a part of the podcast, we would certainly welcome you going to the website and click the link there for join our team and give us some information about you. We can be in touch and figure out how you can do that. And of course, as always, we look for suggestions on topics and other things as well. All of that can be done, again, at the website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. The Room Where It Happened sits as a sub-part of that website now. It's not its own separate website. And so you can also find out everything you want to know about The Room Where It Happened at that same website for Fork in Time. So once again, appreciate you joining me today here on this sort of introductory episode to the exciting new thing that we're going to be doing around the late Bronze Age collapse. Hope that you're part of that. Hope that you're an interactive feedback part of that. And we look forward to doing it. And I'm going to close out here by myself, but saying the same thing that we normally say even when I'm with the other hosts and folks that make the podcast possible. Our suggestion is, if you happen upon that fork in time, we think it's a good idea just to take it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.